The Mustang is a free-roaming horse of the American West that first descended from horses brought to the Americas by the Spanish. Mustangs are often referred to as wild horses, but because they are descended from once-domesticated horses, they are properly defined as feral horses. The original Mustangs were colonial Spanish horses, but many other breeds and types of horses contributed to the modern Mustang, resulting in varying phenotypes. In the 21st century, Mustang herds vary in the degree to which they can be traced to original Iberian horses. Some contain a greater genetic mixture of ranch stock and more recent breed releases, while others are relatively unchanged from the original Iberian stock, most strongly represented in the most isolated populations. In 1971, the United States Congress recognized that wild free-roaming horses and burros are living symbols of the historic and pioneer spirit of the West, which continue to contribute to the diversity of life forms within the nation and enrich the lives of the American people. The free-roaming Mustang population is managed and protected by the Bureau of Land Management. Controversy surrounds the sharing of land and resources by the free-ranging Mustangs with the livestock of the ranching industry, and also with the methods with which the federal government manages the wild population numbers. A policy of rounding up excess population and offering these horses for adoption to private owners has been inadequate to address questions of population control, and many animals now live in temporary holding areas, kept in captivity but not adopted to permanent homes. Advocates for Mustangs also express concerns that the animals may be sold for horse meat. Additional debate centers on the question of whether Mustangs, and horses in general, are native species or an introduced invasive species. Many methods of population management are used, including the adoption by private individuals of horses taken from the range. Etymology and usage. Mustangs are often referred to as wild horses, but since all free-roaming horses now in the Americas descended from horses that were once domesticated, a more proper term is feral horses. Unlike Prulski's horse, the only extant wild horse, the Mustang descended from domesticated horses. The English word Mustang comes from the 16th century Mexican Spanish word Mustangard, defined as animal that strays. It is derived from the Spanish word Mustangard, defined as wild, stray, ownerless. The Spanish word in turn may possibly originate from the Latin expression mixta, referring to beasts of uncertain ownership, which were distributed by ranchers' associations called mustas in Spain in the Middle Ages. Mustangers were usually cowboys in the US and vacas mestaneros in Mexico who caught, broke and drove free-ranging horses to market in the Spanish and later Mexican, and still later American territories of what is now northern Mexico, Texas, New Mexico and California. They caught the horses that roamed the Great Plains and the San Joaquin Valley of California, and later in the Great Basin, for the 18th century to the early 20th century. Characteristics and ancestry. The original Mustangs were colonial Spanish horses, but many other breeds and types of horses contributed to the modern Mustang, resulting in varying phenotypes. Mustangs of all body types are described as sure-footed and having good endurance. They may be of any coat color. Throughout all the herd management areas managed by the Bureau of Land Management, light riding horse type predominates, though a few horses with draft horse characteristics also exist, mostly kept separate from other Mustangs and confined to specific areas. Some herds show the signs of the introduction of thoroughbred or other light race horse types into herds, a process that also led in part to the creation of the American Quarter Horse. The now defunct American Mustang Association developed a breed standard for those Mustangs that carry morphological traits associated with the early Spanish horses. These include a well-proportioned body with a clean, refined head with wide forehead and small muzzle. The facial profile may be straight or slightly convex. Withers are moderate in height and the shoulders to be long and sloping. The standard considers a very short back, deep girth and muscular coupling over the loins as desirable. The croup is rounded, neither too flat nor goose-rumped. The tail is low-set. The legs are to be straight and sound. Hooves are round and dense. Dun color and primitive markings are particularly common amongst horses of Spanish type. Height varies across the West, but most are small, generally 14 to 15 hands, and not taller than 16 hands, even in herds with draft or thoroughbred ancestry. The Mustang of the modern West has several different breeding populations today which are genetically isolated from one another and thus have distinct traits traceable to particular herds. Genetic contributions to today's free-roaming Mustang herds include assorted ranch horses that escaped or were turned out on the public lands, and are stray horses used by the United States Cavalry. For example, in Idaho, some herd management areas contain animals with known descent from thoroughbred and quarter-horse stallions turned out with feral herds. The herds located in 2 HMAs in central Nevada produce curly horses. Others, such as certain bands in Wyoming, have characteristics consistent with gaited horse breeds. Several bands have had DNA testing and are verified to have significant Spanish ancestry. These include the Kidger Mustang, the Spanish.Mustang, and the Pryor Mountain Mustang. Horses in several other HMAs retain Spanish horse traits, such as dun coloration and primitive markings. Other genetic herd studies, such as one done in 2002 on the bands in the Challis, Idaho area, show a very mixed blend of Spanish, North American gaited horse, draft horse and pony influences. A 2010 study of the Pryor herd also showed that those Mustangs shared genetic traits with other domestic horse breeds, presenting strong evidence that modern wild horses were not descended from a prehistoric subspecies that had survived in North America from prehistoric times. Some breeders of domestic horses consider the Mustang herds of the West to be inbred and of inferior quality. However, supporters of the Mustang argue that the animals are merely small due to the harsh living conditions and that natural selection has eliminated many traits that lead to weakness or inferiority. In contrast, a few researchers have advanced an argument that Mustangs should be legally classified as wild rather than feral. They argue that, due to the presence of Equus feris on the North American continent until the end of the Pleistocene era, horses were once a native species and should still be considered as such, defined as wild rather than viewed as an introduced species that draws resources and attention away from true native species. History. Prehistory. The horse family Equidae and the genus Equus evolved in North America. Fossil evidence dating to the Eocene studies using ancient DNA as well as DNA of recent individuals shows the once were two closely related horse species in North America, the wild horse and Equus francisci or New World stilt-legged horse. Horses existed in Canada as recently as 12,000 years ago, and a 1992 study produced evidence that horses existed in the Americas until 8,000–10,000 years ago. Today, the only extant true wild horse is the Prulskis horse, native to Mongolia. The genus Equus in North America died out at the end of the last ice age, possibly due to a changing climate and the impact of newly arrived human hunters. Thus, at the beginning of the Columbian Exchange, there were no equids in the Americas at all. Horses first returned to the Americas with the conquistadors, beginning with Columbus, who imported horses from Spain to the West Indies on his second voyage in 1493. Domesticated horses came to the mainland with the arrival of Corte in 1519. By 1525, Corte had imported enough horses to create a nucleus of horse breeding in Mexico. One hypothesis held that horse populations north of Mexico originated in the mid-1500s with the expeditions of Narvaez de Soto Coronado, but it has been refuted. Horse breeding in sufficient numbers to establish a self-sustaining population developed in what today is the southwestern United States starting in 1598 when Juan de Onate founded Santa Fe de Nuevo Mexico. From 75 horses in his original expedition, he expanded his herd to 800, and from the horse population increased rapidly. While the Spanish also brought horses to Florida in the 16th century, the Choctaw and Chickasaw horses of what is now the southeastern United States are believed to be descended from western Mustangs that moved east, and thus Spanish horses in Florida did not influence the Mustang. 17th and 18th century dispersal. Native American people readily integrated use of the horse into their cultures. They quickly adopted the horse as a primary means of transportation. Horses replaced the dog as a travois puller and greatly improved success in battles, trade, and hunts, particularly bison hunts. Santa Fe became a major trading center in the 1600s. Although Spanish laws prohibited Native Americans from riding horses, the Spanish used native people as servants, and some were tasked to care for livestock, thus learning horse handling skills. Onate's colonists also lost many of the horses. Some wandered off because the Spanish generally did not keep them in fenced enclosures, and native people in the area captured some of these as strays. Other horses were traded by Onate's settlers for food, women or other goods. Initially, horses obtained by native people were simply eaten, along with any cattle that were captured or stolen. But as individuals with horse handling skills fled Spanish control, sometimes with a few trained horses, the local tribes began using horses for riding and as pack animals. By 1659, settlements reported being raided for horses, and in the 1660s the Apache were trading human captives for horses. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 also resulted in large numbers of horses coming into the hands of native people, the largest one-time influx in history. For the Pueblo people, horses were traded to the Apache, Navajo and Utes. The Comanche acquired horses and provided them to the Shoshone. The eastern Shoshone and southern Utes became traders who distributed horses and horse culture from New Mexico to the northern plains. West of the Continental Divide, horses distribution moved north quite rapidly along the western slopes of the Rocky Mountains, skirting desert regions such as the Great Basin and the western Colorado Plateau. Horses reached what today is southern Idaho by 1690. The northern Shoshone people in the Snake River Valley had horses in 1700. By 1730, they reached the Columbia Basin and were east of the Continental Divide in the northern Great Plains. The Blackfeet people of Alberta had horses by 1750. The Nez Perce people in particular became master horse breeders, and developed one of the first distinctly American breeds, the Appaloosa. Most other tribes did not practice extensive amounts of selective breeding, though they sought out desirable horses through acquisition and quickly weeded out those with undesirable traits. By 1769, most Plain Indians had horses. In this period, Spanish missions were also a source of stray and stolen livestock, particularly in what today is Texas and California. The Spanish brought horses to California for use at the missions and ranches, where permanent settlements were established in 1769. Horse numbers grew rapidly, with a population of 24,000 horses reported by 1800. By 1805, there were so many horses in California that people began to simply kill unwanted animals to reduce overpopulation. However, due to the barriers presented by mountain ranges and deserts, the California population did not significantly influence horse numbers elsewhere at the time. Horses in California were described as being of exceptional quality. In the upper Mississippi Basin and Great Lakes regions, the French were another source of horses. Although horse trading with native people was prohibited, there were individuals willing to indulge in illegal dealing, and as early as 1675, the Illinois people had horses. Animals identified as P. Canadian, French, or Norman were located in the Great Lakes region, with the 1782 census at Fort Detroit listing over 1,000 animals. By 1770, Spanish horses were found in that area, and there was a clear zone from Ontario and Saskatchewan to St. Louis where Canadian-type horses, particularly the smaller varieties, crossbred with Mustangs of Spanish ancestry. French-Canadian horses were also allowed to roam freely and move west, particularly influencing horse herds in the northern plains and inland northwest. Although horses were brought from Mexico to Texas as early as 1542, a stable population did not exist until 1686, when Alonso de Leon's expedition arrived with 700 horses. For that, later groups brought up thousands more, deliberately leaving some horses and cattle to fend for themselves at various locations, while others strayed. By 1787, these animals had multiplied to the point that a roundup gathered nearly 8,000 free-roaming Mustangs and cattle. West-central Texas, between the Rio Grande River and Palo Duro Canyon, was said to have the most concentrated population of feral horses in the Americas. Throughout the West, horses escaped human control and formed feral herds, and by the late 1700s, the largest numbers were found in what today are the states of Texas, Oklahoma, Colorado, and New Mexico. 19th century estimates of when the peak population of Mustangs occurred and total numbers vary widely between sources. No comprehensive census of feral horse numbers was ever performed until the time of the Wild and Free-Roaming Horses and Burros Act of 1971, and any earlier estimates, particularly prior to the 20th century, are speculative. Some sources simply state that millions of Mustangs once roamed western North America. In 1959, geographer Tom L. McKnight suggested that the population peaked in the late 1700s or early 1800s, and the best guesses apparently lie between 2 and 5 million. Historian J. Frank Dobie hypothesized that the population peaked around the end of the Mexican-American War in 1848, stating, "My own guess is that at no time were there more than 1 million Mustangs in Texas and no more than 1 million others scattered over the remainder of the West." J. Edward de Steiger questioned Dobie's lower guess as still being too high. In 1839, the numbers of Mustangs in Texas had been augmented by animals abandoned by Mexican settlers who had been ordered to leave the Nueces Strip when the area was finally ceded to the U.S. In 1848, these horses and others in the surrounding areas were rounded up and trailed north and east, resulting in the near elimination of Mustangs in that area by 1860. The first known sighting of a free-roaming horse in the Great Basin was by John Bidwell near the Humboldt Sinks in 1841. Although Fremont noted thousands of horses in California, the only horse sign he spoke of in the Great Basin, which he named, was tracks around Pyramid Lake, and the natives he encountered there were horseless. In 1861, another party saw 7 free-roaming horses near the Stillwater Range. For the most part, free-roaming horse herds in the interior of Nevada were established in the latter part of the 1800s from escaped settlers' horses. 20th century. In the early 1900s, thousands of free-roaming horses were rounded up for use in the Spanish-American War and World War I. By 1920, Bob Brislawn, who was working as a packer for the U.S. government, recognized that the original Mustangs were disappearing, and was making an effort to preserve them, ultimately establishing the Spanish Mustang Registry. In 1934, Derby stated that there were just a few wild horses in Nevada, Wyoming and other western states, and that only a trace of Spanish blood is left in most of them remaining. Other sources agree that by the time only pockets of Mustangs that retained Colonial Spanish horse type remain. By 1930, the vast majority of free-roaming horses were found west of Continental Divide, with an estimated population between 50,000 and 150,000. They were almost completely confined to the remaining General Land Office-administered public lands and National Forest rangelands in the 11 western states. In 1934, the Taylor Grazing Act established the United States Grazing Service to manage livestock grazing on public lands, and in 1946, the GLO was combined with the Grazing Service to form the Bureau of Land Management, which, along with the Forest Service, was committed to removing feral horses from the lands they administered. By the 1950s, the Mustang population dropped to an estimated 25,000 horses. Abuses linked to certain capture methods, including hunting from airplanes and poisoning waterholes, led to the first federal free-roaming horse protection law in 1959. This statute, titled Use of Aircraft or Motor Vehicles to Hunt Certain Wild Horses or Burros, Pollution of Watering Holes, popularly known as the Wild Horse Annie Act, prohibited the use of motor vehicles for capturing free-roaming horses and burros. Protection was increased further by the Wild and Free-Roaming Horses and Burros Act of 1971. The Wild and Free-Roaming Horses and Burros Act of 1971 provided for protection of certain previously established herds of horses and burros. It mandated the BLM to oversee the protection and management of free-roaming herds on lands it administered, and gave U.S. Forest Service similar authority on national forest lands. A few free-ranging horses are also managed by the Fish and Wildlife Service and National Park Service, but for the most part they are not subject to management under the Act. A census completed in conjunction with passage of the Act found that there were approximately 17,300 horses on the BLM-administered lands and 2,039 on national forests. Mustangs today. As of 2015, some populations of free-roaming horses and burros remain protected under the Act, but others have disappeared from places where there were once established populations. A few hundred free-roaming horses survive in Alberta and British Columbia. The BLM considers roughly 26,000 individuals a manageable number, but the feral Mustang population in February 2010 was 33,700 horses and 4,700 burros. More than half of all Mustangs in North America are found in Nevada, with other significant populations in California, Oregon, Utah, Montana, and Wyoming. Another 34,000 horses are in holding facilities. The BLM has established herd management areas to determine where and how many animals will be sustained. More than half of all Mustangs in North America are found in Nevada, with other large populations in California, Oregon, Utah, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. Land use controversies. Controversy surrounds the presence of feral Mustang herds, particularly on public lands. Supporters argue that Mustangs are part of the natural heritage of the American West, whose history predates modern land use practices, and thus the animals have an inherent right of inhabitation. However, others remain vehemently opposed to the presence, arguing that the animals degrade rangeland and compete with livestock and wild species for forage. The debate as to what degree Mustangs and cattle compete for forage is multifaceted. One group of opponents, primarily cattle and sheep ranchers and those who depend on the livestock industry, argue essentially that feral horses degrade rangeland and compete with private livestock for public land forage. The environmentalist community is split over the position of the Mustang within the North American ecosystem. This debate centers on the potential classification of Mustangs as either an introduced species such as cattle, or as a reintroduced native species due to the prehistoric presence of horses in North America, albeit with a gap of thousands of years between their extinction and reintroduction from European stock. Researchers note that most current Mustang herds live in arid areas which cattle cannot fully utilize due to the lack of water sources. Horses are adapted by evolution to inhabit an ecological niche characterized by poor quality vegetation. They cover vast distances to find food and water. They may range 9 times as far from water sources as cattle, traveling as much as 50 miles a day. In addition, horses are Ealdgyth fermenters, meaning that they digest nutrients by means of the cecum rather than by a multi-chambered stomach. While this means that they extract less energy from a given amount of forage, it also means that they can digest food faster and make up the difference in efficiency by increasing the consumption rate. In practical effect, by eating greater quantities, horses can obtain adequate nutrition from poorer forage than can ruminants such as cattle, surviving in areas where cattle will starve. In addition to consuming more fodder than cattle, horses in sizes allow them to graze plants much closer to the ground. For these reasons, the number of horses has to be kept low enough to not exceed the carrying capacity of a given area. While the BLM rates horses by animal unit to eat the same amount of forage as a cow-calf pair 1.0, multiple studies of horse grazing patterns indicate that horses probably consume forage at a rate closer to 1.5 AUM. Modern rangeland management also recommends removing all livestock during the growing season to maximize recovery of the forage. Allowing livestock to graze year-round is not good for the range, and some mismanagement of feral herds can also degrade the range for the wildlife that shares the same area.